and George Tarleon came in. Ivor stopped in his stride. Virginia turned her face to the door. "Hello," Tarleon said, so airily. And he came towards them. "Better, my dear?" Tarleon asked, taking Virginia's hand, and to Ivor, "Septic weather, Marley?" Ivor somehow agreed that it was. "Will you have tea, George?" Virginia asked, "or does this septic weather call for a brandy and soda?" "It calls, Virginia." "With a lump of ice in it, too?" Virginia pressed a bell. And she asked him, "Are you doing anything this evening?" Tarleon laughed, as though she had made a joke. "Nothing that I couldn't do just as well some other evening, then perhaps you'll dine with me here." Virginia cut sharply in. "I don't want to go out," and the door slammed to with a crash, and startled Virginia's hand to her heart. Tarleon stared, and then he laughed. He had an 18th century kind of laugh, and he threw back his head a little, and his eyes wrinkled up, as he laughed. It really was rather funny, that sudden exit. Far below them in the great house, like a cry in the bowels of the earth, a door slammed massively. Chapter 19:1 When, very soon after, Turner received his master's command to pack things, he did not delay, for though he had seen his master darkly furious before now, he did not remember ever to have seen him so very darkly furious. "We go to Narsington by the next train," Ivor told him shortly. "It won't be very tidy," Sir Turner murmured. "No matter," said his master. "And for how long, sir, for the packing?" "Oh, for a few days, man." "I don't know." Ivor impatiently drove him from the room, then called to him, "Tell Mrs. Hope she needn't come down. We can manage." Ivor had lost his temper. He wanted now but one thing, and that violently: to get out of London, out of all this. What he would do then, he had not the faintest idea. He had no other thoughts, there was a furious jumble in his mind. Now and then he would see a white face, a very white little face with livid blue eyes. Caddish eyes. He would think later, out of London. And his impatience dragged him and Turner to Paddington a good half-hour before a train was due to leave for Reading, Newbury, and Hungerford, and when at last it was in, it was passionately mobbed by the crowds going riverwards in the heat, but who stood a chance against the tall, one-armed young man with the straight eyebrows and the defiant nose? Turner breathlessly squeezed in after him, travelling first with a third ticket. "Get there somehow," Turner muttered. And thus to Narsington village, by the Swan's Neck dog cart from Hungerford, to the house of the Mrs. Cloister Smiths beside the ancient bridge over the River Kennet, towards 8 o'clock on a damp and sultry September evening. Turner had bought some eggs in Hungerford, having understood that his master had indicated eggs as the only possible food in such weather. "Scramble them," said Ivor, as they reached the house. "Two, of course." It was a little thing. Just a tiff. His mind accused Virginia, but not resentfully, reasonably. Quite reasonably. and he thought of how he had first been angry when she had said to him, "You get on my nerves." Good God, he thought, are there ever two people who don't get on each other's nerves sometimes? It's an abominable thing, but it happens. But it's ever so much more abominable when it's expressed in words. She's got on my nerves before now, but I haven't said anything. One doesn't. It's one's own fault when someone gets on one's nerves, and one must just let it pass in silence. One doesn't tell the person. It's one of those commonplace insults that are still the deepest. No restraint, Virginia dear, no restraint. Nor me, either, banging the door on you like that. But that made him angry again, when he thought of what had driven him to that furious exit. That was such a grotesque insult. He had been trying so hard to put the thing right. And then, suddenly, without a word to him, to turn to Talion and ask him to dine with her. Of course the dinner didn't matter, what was a dinner more or less? But to use Talion as a weapon of her sudden displeasure with him. Oh, it was childish, grotesque, caddish. Ivor wanted to laugh when he thought of it, but his slamming of that door on them got into his ears, and he couldn't help retesting the fury of that moment. He tried to tell himself that the situation required a sense of humor. The only trace of temper that Turner could find in Ivor in the morning was a little grimness added to his ordinary manner. Turner had scrambled eggs again for breakfast, and Ivor pointed out that he hadn't meant him to go on doing it all the time. There was the soft light of a hesitating sun over the morning. "This morning," he said, "we will fish, Turner. We will cast for trout so that we may catch grayling." Ivor had acquired more than a mile of fishing rights with the house. He was not at all a good fisherman, but one must do something. One generally, however, banged a ball with a squash racket against a wall. "They're rising pretty well, sir," said Turner enthusiastically. He liked going out fishing with his master, for it meant that after a few impossible casts and a few poor ones his master would mutter something about alms and say he would try again later, and would spend the rest of the time prowling up and down while Turner cast for trout, which nearly always turned out to be grayling. His master's capacity for pacing up and down anywhere and everywhere had never ceased to astonish Turner. Carpet or wet grass, all the same to him, thought Turner. Must walk miles, he would tell Mrs. Hope. Pottering up and down like that, one cigarette after another. And what he can find to think about all that time beats me. Beats him too, I think, said Mrs. Hope sympathetically. Poor lamb, the worried way his eyebrows get fixed. But Ivor was not doing very much thinking this morning as he paced up and down, just far enough behind the riverbank not to offend the fish's sensitive nerves. Get on their nerves perhaps, he thought. He had come to a conclusion by the time he had fallen asleep last night, and his awakening had confirmed it. One quarrels, he thought, almost naturally, being human, and then, being human, one makes it up. But in a few days, not straight away. I know what I want in this thing, and Virginia must get to know what she wants, or else we're in a blind alley. There's no sense in being nasty and then falling on each other's necks without having got rid of all the nastiness. She simply must not be able to look at me like that in that horrible way. Caddish eyes. And there was something so, well, blasphemous about those caddish eyes that he had to force his mind away from them, else the thought of them would make him angry again. There are rotten mysteries in us all. The morning was not very eventful as to fishing. Perhaps there was too much light, Ivor vaguely suggested. The afternoon, however, very quickly put that all right, for the hesitating sun was quite obscured by 3 o'clock, and a little later it began to spit, and by 4 it was raining steadily, a wet and steady drizzle. They had passed to the farther side of the bridge, where Turner had seen them rising, and it was there that a telegraph boy, a very wet and sulky little boy who might have been any kind of boy but for the colored envelope in his hand, found them. He had tried the house, he said sulkily. Turner quickly tore open the envelope and handed the wire to Ivor. Seen anything? The boy cheekily asked Turner. Turner looked sharply at him and then down at the basket. The boy thoughtfully examined the 3 grayling in the basket and remarked that they would be getting wet in the rain. No answer, a voice told him, and the little boy plowed sulkily back through the sodden grass to his bicycle against the bridge. Getting too wet now, Ivor remarked, and long strides took him towards the bridge and the house. Turner followed slowly. He would have liked another cast or 2, but Turner never fished alone, for the unwritten law of Turner's fishing was that his master was going to have another go in a minute. Within the house, Ivor had another look at the wire. Come back. That's all. Dear Virginia. She must have rung up his flat and heard where he was from Mrs. Hope. But one either does a thing or one doesn't. One can't go dashing about the country because of whims and wires. It's no good our being babies about this, Virginia, he thought. We must get sensible, somehow. Find out what we want and then not mess about with it like this. Come back. Of course he would go back, he had never intended otherwise. But in a day or 2, say the day after tomorrow, when our minds are rested from the folly of the thing and we'll never need to speak of it again. Of course he didn't want to attach too much importance to childishness, but still, those eyes. He couldn't entirely forgive those strangely livid eyes. They had startled and hurt him frightfully, and they kept on coming into his mind. Caddish. The day after tomorrow, he thought firmly. Not going back until I've forgotten that look. After dinner he read The Life of Disraeli, the 3rd volume. And once, when he looked up, he caught a vivid glimpse of a lovely grave face between Golden Swan and Edgar. And at that very moment he almost went to London, to run to the heart of that mausoleum. 3 Now Ivor was not fool enough to confound his weakness with his principles, not entirely. And he had never had any principles in love but love. And so the next afternoon, as he was prowling about the riverbank in preparation for another go in a minute. He reasoned between his desire to go to Virginia there and then and the hitch that kept him back. Firstly and mainly, he candidly thought, it's hurt pride. In fact, it's only that. But it's not resentment against her that keeps me from going until tomorrow. It's just that I want to wipe away all trace of that hurt pride, so that I can meet her clean. Yes, clean. I can't go with a nasty secret in my heart. And although I want so much to see her today, I shall want to see her so much more tomorrow that the whole thing, hurt pride included, will bubble away in the rush. Oh, yes, oh, yes. For all that, he spilled his after-dinner coffee. He spilled it by jumping up from his chair as Turner was at his elbow with it. And the cup broke on the table. Oh, said Turner. Going to London tonight, Turner? Ivor cried gaily. What was a coffee cup? But there's no train now, sir. And, having looked at the local guide, there was not. What about the car? Ivor asked. Turner looked very doubtful about the car. Well, we might look anyway, Ivor said briskly. Get the key and candle and come along. The Mrs. Cloister Smiths had not kept a car, but there was a small shed to the right of the house in which such a car as Ivor's could quite well be kept. It was a poor-looking car, and it gained rather than lost in the light of the candle that Turner held to it. It was an American car. After the splendid two-seater, the dear old Camelot car had been stolen, that epidemic of car stealing, Ivor had bought this off a man. It was the kind of car that one does buy off a man. But Ivor didn't care what it looked like, so long as it could get about and was easily driven with one arm. It'll do, he had said with a grin, when he had first seen it. And it had done, so long as he used it constantly, but once out of commission for any length of time it seemed to retire within itself, and then to show a great disinclination ever to move again. It had now been in the shed for nearly 6 months, and looked it. Bit damp for it here, said Turner. They looked at the car. Turner knew a bit about cars, but he hadn't troubled to know much about this one. Turner despised this car, compared to that shining two-seater. Petrol, said Ivor. And while Turner emptied a green tin, Ivor fiddled about with the switchboard. There wasn't much to fiddle about with on that switchboard, and then threw up the bonnet and pressed things thoughtfully. Turner thought of the rain outside, and he looked at the car. Won't get to London in this, he thought disgustedly. Come on, man, cried Ivor. It won't start by staring at it. Give it a twist. Turner gave it several twists, for the American's starting handle was not one of those fierce ones that object to being twisted. Turner twisted furiously, but only the thinnest of gurgles resulted. It's not going tonight, Turner said. He was glad. Ivor pressed the carburetor until it was wet with petrol. Let me, he said, and he twisted furiously. There's something wrong, sir, said Turner. He was very glad. And Ivor suddenly laughed. He had suddenly seen a picture of Turner and himself battling with that absurd and dirty old car in a ramshackle shed, trying to get to London and Virginia, and he laughed. "All right," he comforted Turner. "I'll go up tomorrow morning by the 9:15. You can come up later with the things. I won't be coming back here for some time, I expect. Not for a long time. I shall walk to Hungerford," he said, "so call me early." Chapter XX1 But, of course, Turner did not need to call him, and Ivor was striding along the road to Hungerford by 8 o'clock. He had plenty of time in which to do the just over 2 miles before the train was due to leave, but his impatience needed swift movement. Ivor never could loiter, not even on a fine morning in Berkshire, and even in his pacings up and down he would sometimes go at a furious rate and find himself perspiring, about nothing at all. Ivor couldn't, notice the country when there was anything on his mind. It was an inability, like that of those tiresome people who cannot appreciate poetry unless it's read to them by someone they like. A mountain would have to be an enormous mountain before Ivor, with anything on his mind, could become aware of it. And even then he would be more aware of it if there was a man on top of it. A landscape would have to be an amazing landscape before Ivor, with anything on his mind, could become aware of it, and even then he would feel it more acutely if there was a figure against the landscape. People were important to Ivor, that is why he was a solitary. And that is why men become solitaries, because people are important to them. People could make places beautiful or ugly for Ivor. And now he simply tore along the road to Hungerford as though it had been a street in a slum, and through the fine September mist as though he hated cigarette smoke. And as he strode along his mind was gay on life and Virginia, and his hat swung from his hand, and his thick hair shone black and brown with the water of its brushing. It was about a mile from Hungerford that, as he turned the corner which led to a path across the fields directly to the station, he almost collided with the little telegraph boy on his bicycle. The boy jumped off sulkily, and tugged at his pocket. "Telegram," said the boy. "Ivor read, please come back. Virginia." And he saw that it had been sent off at 5:45 the day before. "Why didn't I get this last night?" he asked sharply. "Office closes 6:30, the boy explained. "Can't deliver telegrams Narsington after 6. "Ought to live in Hungerford," the boy said cheekily. The tall, dark man looked suddenly ferocious. "If," he began, and then, to the boy's amazement, he started to run away. Ivor pulled himself up with a kind of fierce laugh. "No good running to catch a train before it's in a station," he thought. It was the please in the wire that had set him running, suddenly, the idea of it. Please. One was always hearing and saying that word, and yet it had that amazing and potent meaning. The pity of it, and the generosity in it. Please, she had written. It stabbed his heart, that word. He saw her lips saying it, those taut and dry and beautiful lips that liked the rush of a chill wind. He heard them saying it in his ears. Please, Ivor. and all his gaiety was lost in regret for his folly of yesterday, his folly of wisdom in not having gone to her before. He had let her write pleas to him. God, Virginia and her beastly men. It was beyond his power to prevent himself walking quickly, and he had a long wait at Hungerford station, up and down the far end of the London platform. It seemed like hours, before anyone but a porter or two was visible. But at last motors began to twist round the slope from Hungerford and down to the station, and soon the platform was dotted with people and suitcases. Then the train from London bustled in at the opposite platform, and soon a boy came round with papers. Ivor bought the Times, and, as an afterthought, the Daily Mirror, thinking to while away the minutes before his train came in, and one arm not being sufficient to cope with the Times in the open. With that pressed under his arm he held up the picture paper at an angle, and then, with a frown, he held it up straight, as he did so, dropping the Times from under his arm. He didn't pick it up. He stared at one of the several pictures on the front page, a face he knew, looking so strange, so odd, just there. And he knew the photograph too. It was an old one and often reproduced, for it was a stock photograph and used on the smallest provocation. They had often laughed at it together, calling it Virginia arrogant. It was a little blurred. But why there? And though he saw the large type above it, though his eyes read it, and then read it again, he simply could not take it in. Oh, absurd! Death of the Viscountess Tarleon. Oh, but rot! His hand trembled ever so little as he held the paper higher to read the small type below Virginia arrogant. We regret to announce the sudden death of the beautiful Viscountess Tarleon at her house in Belgrave Square towards 8 o'clock last night. Ivor very consciously, very determinedly, closed his eyes and then he opened them again. Yes. There was Virginia arrogant in front of him. Then he looked about the platform. It seemed suddenly to be crowded with people, and they all seemed to be yelling about something. He turned to the small type again, Lady Tarleon, who will perhaps be better remembered as the Honourable Virginia Tracy and later as Mrs. Hector Sarden, underwent a serious operation some weeks ago, from which it was thought she had quite. He skipped a few words, presumably went out too soon, walking in the rain of the day before yesterday, and contracted a chill which, in her weak state of health, only too soon. Everyone will rig, Viscount Tarley. He simply couldn't see any more of the type. His eyes wouldn't take it in, and there was a frightful noise in his ears. Everyone seemed to be yelling right at him. People shouting, people pushing, porters. London train. Stop at Newbury and Reading. London train, bang into his ear. Doors slammed to. And then the train seemed to move across his eyes, kept on moving. "Come on, sir, come on," a voice cried impatiently. Ivor shook his head at the voice and bent down to pick up the Times at his feet. Someone had trodden on it. He left the station very slowly, the way he had come, through the turnstile into the fields, clutching the papers. Oh, rot! In the rain of the day before yesterday, it said. He stopped and looked at the paper again, and, somehow dropping them both onto the path, left them both there. But that was the day she had sent him the first wire. How then? He couldn't understand it at all, he couldn't make head or tail of the thing. Why, damn it, she'd sent him a wire only yesterday evening, 5:45. And then, quite clearly, he knew that Virginia hadn't written that wire herself, she had told Little Smith to write it. Virginia wouldn't have signed the wire. Virginia, she would never have signed a wire to him. She hadn't signed the wire that had taken him to Simier's, she hadn't signed the first wire. In the rain of the day before yesterday. Oh, my God! He must have been walking at a furious pace, for he had to stop to wipe his face with his handkerchief. His face was wet, dripping wet. That wire, that first wire. Come back. He saw it now, all of it, everything. His thoughts tore round that first wire in a kind of fierce circle, a clear circle, round and round it, round and round every detail of it. In the rain of the day before yesterday. He saw and heard Virginia, very white of face. As though he was there now, he saw Virginia on that day. Just after luncheon. Virginia always called it luncheon, never lunch. And where shall we luncheon today, she'd say. Drizzling outside. He heard her voice, rather sharp and hard. I'm going out, Smith. Oh, my zilplew, milady. That anxious little Smith. So fearful of and for her mistress. I am going out, Smith. To send a wire. And he saw the sharp and dangerous gesture with which Virginia cut short poor little Smith's cry that she could send the wire. My zilplew, milady. But I wish to send it myself. No more now. You can come with me if you like. No, I can't wait for the car. And I want to walk. Good God, why shouldn't I walk just for once? The sudden and sweeping impatience. Oh, milady, milady. And he saw Virginia walking. Long swift strides through the drizzle towards the post office in Knightsbridge. She wanted to send it herself. It was an idea. Oh, he knew, he knew. He saw everything, he saw Virginia's heart. She wanted to send that wire herself. Ivor would know. And the anxious little Smith trotting along just behind her, breathlessly. Oh, milady, milady. Holding up an umbrella in front of her, trying to cover Virginia with it, panting a little after those swift Virginian strides. Never in her life had Virginia walked under an umbrella, you couldn't conceive it. Always she had been just ahead of an umbrella, just outside it, and someone panting, laughing, crying behind her. Not an umbrella woman, Virginia. Striding towards Knightsbridge with set white face, so determined, heroically set. But she was heroic. Eyes straight ahead, a soldier's eyes. Fearless eyes. Those curious eyes that could make molehills out of mountains, Why had he never thought of that before? And agonized little Smith in her blue waterproof, panting behind with her umbrella inclined forwards. Oh, milady, milady. And then she had sent that first wire. Those 2 words, "Come back." Everything was in those 2 words, imperious and humble, ashamed and forgiving, and so generous. Everything of Virginia and of love was in those 2 quick words, and he hadn't seen it. He hadn't seen Virginia's heart, that lovely and mysterious heart. He had been like a swine before the 2 pearls in that wire. He just hadn't seen. And then she had gone back home, maybe not so swiftly, and happily, oh, yes, happily. He could see the light in her eyes as she walked back home, not so swiftly, the merry light in Virginia's eyes, trusting Ivor. He would come back quickly. And little Smith had been glad. But he hadn't gone. And when she had got back to the mausoleum she had shivered a little from the damp, and was soon in bed with a chill, quite slight at first, oh, very minor, but quick to feed on Virginia's so weak health, terribly quick and wanton in its fierceness, and to her lungs, easily. And he had not gone. My God, he had not gone. And then that second wire, 5:45 yesterday. Virginia had waited all day, growing worse all day. She had waited for him. And at last, at 5:30, say, she had commanded Smith to send that wire, please. And she had commanded Smith on pain of death to say nothing of her being ill. Just write, please come back. Weaker and weaker every minute, the chill in her lungs. Poor Virginia, brave Virginia. Oh, milady, milady. Pitiful at last. Dying, maybe she knew she was dying when she told Smith to send that wire, maybe she was at last seeing the dead end of her fears. And no Ivor in the dead end this time. Ah, she was fey, this Virginia. He had always known. And how he had started to run this morning, ages ago. He had known something. Please, she had said. And now in his ears. And he had wanted everything. And haven't I given you everything, Ivor? She softly asked. He heard her. How she would say, Ivor, telling him that the name pleased her heart. Funny Virginia, she was so mysterious. Every woman has a legend, there is a legend to every woman. His was a terrible crime. From a silly, trivial thing this crime had been born, but it was a terrible crime. He had killed Virginia, he had closed the reckless light in Virginia's eyes. The brave and hazardous eyes, of white Virginia. But why did he see her, think of her, as white? And his mind searched furiously. And at last his mind found a dream in which was a column of marble. Oh, yes, that funny dream. And the naked white figure clinging to that column, so white she looked up there, clinging to it with white arms and legs, and destroying it with kisses. That dream had given him Virginia and him to Virginia. And as he walked headlong up the roads of Berkshire he dreamed that dream again. The first shock Turner received that day was on seeing a tall figure approaching from Hungerford. Well, he thought. Turner and luggage were in the Narsington grocer's cart on their way to the station. Pull up, he said to the man. "'E's coming the wrong way." "Coming quick, whichever way," murmured the Narsington grocer. And the figure was coming quick. As he approached them, drawn up at the side of the road, Turner cried, "I say, sir." But though he cried "I say, sir," twice more, the figure passed them without stopping. The figure certainly glanced at them, but seemed to see or hear nothing. "Balmy," said the Narsington grocer. And the figure strode on, his hat swinging furiously from his one hand. Turner took off his derby and scratched his head. "Right about turn," he said at last, patiently. The old nag wheeled slowly round, and ambled after the figure with the waving right arm. "'E looks dark," commented the Narsington grocer. Turner was perturbed. "Like the Wandering Jew," he said softly. "No less." And Turner whistled softly, patiently. The Narsington grocer's horse was old and unused to hurrying. It did not hurry now, and the striding figure of his master was soon lost to Turner's solicitous eye round a bend. But when he reached the house he was offended to find no one there. "Well," Turner muttered. Whereupon the Narsington grocer thought fit to ask a question. "Oh, go 'ome," said Turner sharply. Then he waited for a long time. And he got bored to death. For there was nothing for him to do about the house. He didn't know whether they were to stay or go to London. Angieing about, he muttered. Turner, like his master, liked to know where he was, and now he wasn't anywhere, unless being between Narsington and London, and going without lunch was being somewhere. He waited for hours. It was after 2 o'clock, and he was hungry, and, examining the kitchen, he found half a loaf of bread and 1 egg. "Scramble it," he mimicked viciously. He boiled it. And then Turner had a curious feeling. He felt that he didn't belong to this Narsington house today. He belonged to Upper Brook Street, where he would have been this moment but for having said right about turn. And so, having that curious feeling, Turner stood on the front door steps and smoked a cigarette. He stared at the Kennet. It was still, placid. Nothing rising. And then he had to throw his cigarette away, for round the corner of the drive strode a dark figure. Right at him. Turner was shocked. "Talk about sweat," he said later to Mrs. Hope. His master's face glistened with it. It dripped from him. If he had been wearing a hard collar it would have melted. His dark hair was all over the place, and there was a dry, red rim around his eyes as though he had been in a great wind. Turner pulled himself together and took a letter out of his pocket. It was addressed in pencil, and he had great hopes of that letter. "Letter, sir," he muttered. "Came just after you left this." The dark figure was gone into the house. 3 in the sitting room. Ivor looked at the letter. That penciled scrawl, so careless always, so much more careless on this envelope, so faint. But how? He stared at it. Dear God, she had written it in bed yesterday, just in case he might not come. Fearing. Forgiving him, humbling herself. And then, for the first time, he gave a sob. He knew everything that was in that letter, every word. Her lips were by his ear, telling him the words of that letter. I'm sorry to have been a beast, Ivor, I'm so sorry. Everything is all right, Ivor, everything. I'm so sorry I hurt you, only, you see, you aren't casual enough. Keep your eyebrows straight for me, my darling, don't bring them down into the darkness. Be a little more casual, Ivor, oh. He not casual enough. And it was impossible for him to open that thin envelope crushed in his hand. Turner tiptoed to the door of the sitting room. He had heard that sob, and was amazed and afraid. And then Turner saw a strange thing. He saw a one-armed man without resource in his mind trying to tear across an unopened envelope. The one-armed man had his knee up to and pressed against the edge of the table, and under the knee was half the envelope, and his fingers were childishly tearing at the other half, and at last the other half came away in his fingers. Then eyes looked at Turner at the door, and Turner ran away. Like a lot of mad babies crying in a man's inside, he tried to explain that look to Mrs. Hope. Epilogue. The image in the heart. Chapter I1. Towards midnight on the night of the 1st of May, 1921, at the sign of the Morn Angel, and, at this moment, under the passing glance of the polite and amiable M. Stutz, who never went to bed, never, but his wife did, and had. Ivor Pelham Marley, looking up at last from the abyss of his coffee cup, now a sad-looking mess of ashes and ends of many cigarettes, caught M. Stutz's eye gently on him. Ivor smiled self-consciously, and he made a displeased little gesture at the untouched glass of Napoleonic brandy before him. I'm thirsty, M. Stutz, he whispered. And he looked round him stealthily, his first look round for ever such a long time, and saw but 3 other people in the shuttered restaurant: Cornelius Vale, Mr. Carrison, and a young woman with tawny hair, pallid face, and crimson lips that smiled without meaning, a pathetic rebel. What about a whiskey and soda? Asked Ivor softly. At once, said M. Stutz, very low, and quickly concerned himself with it behind the counter. This matter of whiskey and soda was, you understand, something of a conspiratorial rite in the establishment of M. Stutz. He disapproved of whiskey and soda. It is an untidy drink, said M. Stutz. He discouraged it among my customers, and it was only to the most favored among them that he would dream of serving it. To others he would say, rather stiffly, I do not serve whiskey, sir, and did not. Thus, the most favored must in all decency look carefully round the room before begging M. Stutz's complaisance in this particular, lest the less favored should be envious and also demand whiskey instead of the wine they were drinking. And that would never do at all, for the wines of M. Stutz's cellar were not only the treasures of his heart but also the columns which supported the formidable edifice of his income. This matter of the whiskey and soda must be pursued yet a little further, before we are finally done with it, the morn angel, and Stutz, for it was on its wings, if such will be allowed to so vulgar a drink, that Ivor finally left the morn angel. His way with a whiskey and soda was drastic and medicinal. The glass was raised, and lo! The glass was laid down empty. Money passed between Ivor and Stutz, and Ivor made ready to go. It's raining, just a little, Stutz told him. Shall I send for a taxi? Ivor said he would walk, thanks very much, and was politely preceded by Stutz towards the side door into the hotel passage, for the restaurant door was closed and locked in pursuance of certain regulations to that effect, and up that narrow passage to the hotel door, which was pierced, you will remember, by ever such a little eye-hole. It was as Stutz had his hand on the latch of the door that he turned to Ivor behind him, and he examined Ivor, for a moment, seriously and thoughtfully. You know, Mr. Marley, said Stutz softly, you are a clever man, but you do not know how to live. I have observed it, I've never observed anything else, returned Ivor, with the shadow of a smile. I fancy, said Stutz, that you live too much with your emotions, Mr. Marley, and not enough with your brains. Ah, said Ivor vaguely. I am only a little restaurateur, said Stutz, with his epic gesture, but I hear things. They say you are very clever, but that you are doing nothing now. Of course people are only too ready to say that a young man who has done something is going to pieces, but I would not like you to go to pieces, Mr. Marley. That is very kind of you, Stutz, said Ivor sincerely, I'll make a note of what you say. Good night, Stutz. And thank you. The amiable restaurateur, from the hotel doorway, meditated a little on the tall figure that swung swiftly out of sight round the corner into Oxford Street, and then, carefully and thoughtfully, he closed and bolted the hotel door, for the morn angel would not be at home to any more visitors that night, no matter of what degree. And who, in the lists of sudden visitors by night, was left to replace Virginia? That fair and grave figure of the night, that so lovely ornament of the closed and shuttered morn angel. Who now was left, among the gallants of the London night, who could so perfectly compound complaisance with quality, silence with speech, ease with distance? Who so soigny, yet so understanding of others' carelessness, as Virginia Tarleon? Ah, it was death's most bloodthirsty joke to kill Virginia, the lady of the merry golden curls and of the fair, small face in which was something gay, something sombre. Often, very often, the eyes of Stutz, looking round at the familiar faces of my customers, would acutely miss the loveliness of that fine lady, and, moved unawares to a considerable sincerity, he would ache for her. For Stutz was a connoisseur of quality. Stutz was concerned and sympathetic about Ivor, not entirely because he, of course, knew of the love of Ivor and Virginia, and had considered it a happy fusion. Stutz was a snob, in a real and literary sense, and loved a grand seigneur. He loved the thing without a title, he loved the face and gesture of the thing, and, to his mind, a certain degree of silence best accorded with features on which was stamped the tired mark of race. It was M. Stutz's daily business to deal with people in whom there was much froth, and he dealt with them very amiably, but he did not like frothiness. Here it was that Virginia had pleased him, and here Ivor Marley pleased him. There was no froth in him. He sought no favor but what was accorded to him in courtesy in return for courtesy. And so it had always pleased M. Stutz to expect great things from the dark young man whom he had first seen in his early 20s, and his expectations had waxed rather than waned on hearing the faint bruit of the love of Ivor and Virginia, for Virginia, M. Stutz had thought, would bring fineness to a point in a man like Ivor Marley, even though she had seemed to fail so deplorably with Hector Sarden and Lord Tarleon. But now, allowing for the havoc of her death in him, M. Stutz did not think that a sum of 3 books, the first of which was negligible, was worthy of a man who must have turned 32. And M. Stutz was unconsciously echoing a sentence of Aunt Percy's when he told himself that perhaps Ivor Marley was too much given to thinking, and that thinking made him angry. But Ivor, striding along Oxford Street, was not thinking about anything in particular. His mind had suddenly taken a lazy turn, even as he had left the Mornagel. It will be remembered that the air on the night of the 1st of May, 1921, or rather, in the early hours of the 2nd of May, for it struck 12:30 as Ivor reached Oxford Circus, was cool but soft, a first herald of what was to be a summer of unprecedented warmth and drought. The drought, however, as will also be remembered, was not then so remarkable as it later became, and on this particular night there was noticeable, to a student of London, a vague kind of rain in the air. It would naturally not be anywhere else, but on the other hand it didn't seem to reach the ground, not quite, which was not unpleasant, to a student of London, anyway. Such a one was Ivor Marley become, for he had long since overcome the bitterness of his loneliness in London, and now he loved London with what a lady's journal would call a bitter love. Of late months he had very often walked about London by night, and the feel of it had somehow crept into his bones. It was not a sleek city, like Paris. It was a city of splendid and ordered carelessness. There were holes and gashes in it where your Parisian would have had boulevards. There were sharp turns and funny little slums where any other city would have had an immaculate avenue leading to a most immaculate place full of corrupt taxis and unshaven police. He was at Oxford Circus, and stood debating there, just by the tube station. The rain held, but did not incommode. There were very few passengers, a figure or two, a woman or two, and taxis hurtling by. Ivor was wearing, above his dinner jacket, a black trilby. Now a short man wearing a black trilby looks like nothing on earth, or, say, like something from South America, but it is quite becoming to a tall man, and can lend an almost sinister air to the usual convention of faces. Ivor, as he stood looking across Oxford Circus, with his black trilby at the usual angle and a white flower brave upon the lapel of his jacket, looked just a little sinister. He stared across Oxford Circus. He wanted to walk, anywhere. Down Regent Street, or across the circus towards the park. And this last he suddenly did, thinking that the only thing to do with Oxford Circus was to cross it. He walked, and this walk, so usual in character, in place, in circumstance, was yet to chance on so strange a happening that forever after Ivor couldn't help trying to find in it some faint atom of forewarning, say, in his thoughts. But his thoughts, after having left the Mornagel, had taken that lazy turn. The fierce depression of that day and evening had gone, leaving behind but the usual, half-humorous gloom of his present nature, for he had acquired, or rather rediscovered, for it had always been in him, a way of treating things nonsensically with himself, just as though Virginia was beside him in that little garden of the studio over Paris, our Uri, out of ken. He managed, within himself, to twist many things to comic phrases and the like, so that the mind behind those straight and sulky eyebrows was often roaring with laughter about something which wouldn't have seemed in the least funny when spoken. He walked to the Marble Arch, and thence down Park Lane, where was little movement. The not unpleasant rain still seemed to encounter certain difficulties in reaching the ground. He chose the park side of the road, and walked by the railings. He peered into the darkness of the park, and it displeased him. A closed and shuttered park by night, with wide and empty roads laid across it like the arms of a sprawling skeleton, is a most abominable thing. There is no beauty in it thus, no mystery, and sensitive eyes must reject its dark and dank attractions through the railings. He walked. Fight on all occasions. Now who the deuce had said that? Ah, yes, D'Artagnan's father to D'Artagnan. Wise old man. For if you fight on all occasions you simply must, by the laws of chance, win now and then. He walked to the corner of Hamilton Place and Piccadilly, and there stayed a while, for it is a romantic station by night. The vague and careless rain looked like threads of gossamer silver passing across the light of the arc lamps. Standing here, at the corner of Hamilton Place, Piccadilly grows wide to the eye and sweeps to far distances. Here, by night, there are palaces all about you, there are spacious places before you, the Green Park is a mysterious valley, and somewhere in the spaciousness is a horseman on a horse and a chariot on a triumphal arch. An arch that is much more impressive by night than in that festive daylight when under its squat curve pass the automata of royalty. Here, at the corner of Hamilton Place, Piccadilly ceases to be Piccadilly and becomes something more than Hyde Park Corner. Surely it becomes a wide and elegant gesture, the magnificent gesture of Babylon towards the barbaric extremities of its tributaries. Here motor cars, that but a moment before looked large and luxurious on the thin spine of Piccadilly, dwindle to small and flying atoms, hurling themselves headlong into the fat bosom of Belgrave Square, straight ahead to the narrow rectitudes of Brompton, or still farther to the very frontiers of the town, where is said to lie Holland Park and beyond which is Hammersmith and a great darkness. He walked down the slope of Piccadilly, that slight downward slope of Piccadilly as it gathers strength to hunch itself up for its onslaught on the town. And Ivor saw a much younger man, so gay, so careless, in a swift and shining car, that Camelot car, Magdalen. Racing down and up the switchback of Piccadilly by night, on the wings of love from Camelot. Ah, les tendresses! Admirable Magdalen! You have decorated my life, he had cried to her, so cheekily. But so she had, and so Virginia had too, and almost destroyed it as well. While he had utterly destroyed Virginia. Down street. He would walk up down street, through Shepherd's Market, and so home to Upper Brook Street. And he began the ascent, on the side opposite to the tube station. A clock gave one distant knell, 1 o'clock of the 2nd of May. The puny rain held. The tube station was closed, and shutters were laid across its face. Now by Down Street tube station is a passageway, no one knows why or whither. Whether or not this passageway belongs to the tube station has never been established, nor if it does for what purpose, nor if it does not for what purpose. In fact, nothing is known about this passageway but that it looks a cavernous place. But now this passageway was made remarkable to a passing man by the fact that a woman was standing within it. There, just within the passageway, Ivor saw a woman. He saw her as he passed up on the opposite side. Her face and head were in the darkness of the cavernous place, but the light of the adjacent lamp fell brightly on the lower part of her cloak, and this cloak looked grey and soft and shining with a furry shine. It looked like a cloak made of delicious shillings. And Ivor thought to himself, if that isn't chinchilla, I'd like to know what is. Beyond that passing glimpse he had, immediately, no other, for he walked on up Down Street. But the chinchilla coat waved before his mind. It's all very odd, he thought. What's a chinchilla coat doing out alone at this time of night? It's not decent. He had walked far enough to be able, decently, to turn and look again. The soft gleam of the chinchilla was still there, more than ever like a delicious shilling wantonly awaiting a beggar's grasp. Give her 5 minutes, thought Ivor, and if her man hasn't turned up by then I must see about her. Wandering about in a chinchilla coat on a night like this. I will offer her my friendship for 5 minutes, stressing the word friendship so that she will know I am a man without casual desires. Ha! He felt, at this moment, very gay. Lighting a cigarette, he walked slowly as far as Hertford Street, and slowly back, down the hill of Down Street. The rain was at last managing to reach the ground. Let it, thought Ivor. He felt gay. The hours of his life stretched before him like a desert, but he felt gay. The days and years of his life stretched before him like a wilderness of stones, but he felt gay, and he didn't know why. Quickly Ivor approached, on the opposite side, the soft and furry gleam of the chinchilla coat. He laughed at himself. What a dog I am, he thought. If he thought I were a poet, I would write a poem about a lonely lady in a chinchilla coat. Not being a poet, I will speak to her instead. Thus. And he crossed the road with a swing. He didn't care. The face of the chinchilla was not visible, as he approached. Above the face was a suggestion of hair. A tall figure, taller than Virginia, very tall. But he wasn't afraid. He didn't care. And with his one arm he swept off his hat. "Can I," he pleaded, "be of any use at all?" "You can get me a taxi," came voice of Chinchilla, swift and low. "Certainly," said Ivor, and instantly left her, to search for it. Autocrat, he thought. None of your meek stuff about her. Piccadilly again. There were taxis on the rank 100 yards or so up on the sulky side, nice and polite taxis now that the war was over. In Down Street, he told the first driver, "There's a tube station and a chinchilla coat. Stop by them." The driver grunted, and drove. And, as he slowed down by the tube, the chinchilla coat stepped out from the cavernous place and was visible as a tall woman in a chinchilla coat, no more, for over her head was thrown a kind of motoring veil which obscured what might be golden hair and suggested what might be a young and lovely face. But of course, Ivor thought, she's lovely. A plain woman wouldn't have the cheek. He jumped off the footboard, and opened the door for her. "You may as well see me to my door now," came voice of Chinchilla softly. Suddenly, he couldn't tell why, the desire for laughter left him. "Yes," he only said. She made a gesture for him to get into the cab first. "I will direct him," she said. There was silence in the cab. The lady seemed to have no desire to speak, and Ivor, though he wanted to hear her voice again, suddenly found he had nothing to say at all, to this strange lady. It was like an occasion out of a book by a young romanticist, yet she was very real, this woman. He could feel her clean reality, and her voice had that low and careless charm of a woman whose feet are on an Aubusson carpet and whose heart is not subject to sudden impulses. She was calm. Calm. A delicious state. He wanted her to speak, and she suddenly did. "Tell me," the voice came with gentle interest, "are other men like you, or are you exceptional?" "Well," Ivor hesitated. "I'm afraid I have been rather impertinent." And he deprecated his presence just a little, towards the dark poise of her head. "Yes, you have been impertinent, I suppose," the voice said softly. "But I wasn't thinking of that. I was wondering if it was usual with men to be gallant. You see," the voice explained, "I know very little about men. About young men." Then Ivor suddenly had an idea. "I say," he almost blurted, "I'm all right, you know. I mean, well, I don't want anything. You mustn't think that I have any, well, ulterior motive, because I haven't. I just thought I'd speak to you. It's rather difficult to explain, it seems to be." The voice suddenly laughed at him. And the taxi stopped. Ivor stepped out, with reluctance, for the drive had been short, too short, and, though he had no ulterior motive, he would have liked to speak to her a while longer. But, even as he stepped out onto the curb, he murmured softly, "Well, I'm damned." For he saw that they were in Hertford Street, and just at that part of Hertford Street which is at the head of Down Street. And there, 100 yards or so down the slope of it, was the tube station. The chinchilla coat laughed, a slight wave of a laugh it was, from the recess of the taxi. "I live here," she said. "But I told him to drive round by Hamilton Place." "I thought it would be fun to see your puzzled face," she said. "I've never had much fun." Her sudden plaint from the darkness made him, standing by the door, frightfully shy, and he said nothing, awkwardly. He stood aside while she stepped out. And, in the lamplight, he saw her face for the first time, as she brushed by him, a young and beautiful profile, curiously sedate, too, it seemed, passing by his eyes. "She's a person," he couldn't help thinking. He remained by the throbbing taxi. He did not follow her to the door of the house, lest she should think he wanted to follow the occasion indoors. And he did want to, very much, but he could make no move lest she should be made uncomfortable at a thought of his insistence. He watched the tall figure. She was very tall, taller than Virginia, fit a latchkey in the door. He watched her open the door, and he saw her turn her head to him. He took off his hat quickly. "Goodbye, Chinchilla," he said. She smiled a little. "You must be a very dangerous man," she said thoughtfully, "to be in such a hurry not to put your restraint to the test." It was, after all, very surprising of her to say that, just that. "You can come in for a moment," she said. "I would like you to come in for a moment." And Ivor, making a sign to the taxi driver, followed the chinchilla coat into number 78 Hertford Street. Chapter 2. Once in the hall of the house, she did not look round at him. Her steps rang sharply on the stone flags as she passed to a door at the far end of the wide and somber hall of stone, for in it only one lamp was alight. He threw his hat on a chair and, in following her, had time to be surprised at the spaciousness about him. For, from the outside, the house had looked one of those tall and narrow houses common in Mayfair, where ground rent is high. There had been no hint of this wide and spacious hall in which the lightest steps resounded portentously. It was like the hall of a house in, say, Carlton House Terrace. It was a hall to hold two butlers, now that footmen have become vulgar, the one to take your hat and the other your name, and at its extremity, near the door through which the chinchilla had passed, there swept upwards with a wide sweep a noble marble stairway, the kind of stairway from the top of which men may fairly envisage the ascending grace of the women who might have loved them or the shortcomings of the women they have married, for very grievous for a mediocre figure is the ascending of such a gracious stairway as this. The house was very still, but it is not unusual for a house to be very still towards 1:30. And as Ivor followed the tall lady into the room at the foot of the noble stairway, he wondered why she was doing this odd thing, but, since men cannot help thinking of such things, he did not seriously consider the idea that her invitation would finally include her bed. For any fool can tell a romantic lady from a calm lady, and she was deliciously calm. Probably she was bored, Ivor thought, and would amuse herself a while, and so, though he did not feel very amusing tonight, he would try to be as pleasant as possible. And he wouldn't mind a drink, anyway, but he didn't get a drink. Too, her voice met him as he went into the room. It was a large and wide room, and it was dim, for she had switched on but a few lights, faint electric lights hidden in subtle vases here and there about the expanse of the room. "Don't, please, be shy," her voice met him, the calm voice, "for I'm quite shy enough for two. And I asked you in because I want you to talk to me, just a little." He came forward towards her across the rugs that strewed the parquet floor. There were many things in that room, chairs and footstools and sofas of quality, but yet it was a room for leisured feet, a room easy to move in. She stood by the nobly carven fireplace, a figure in chinchilla, under which was visible a low-cut black dress, and this shone a little as though it were made of black armor, even as black sequins do sometimes shine. "Well, it makes a man shy," he protested, "to try to live up to the fact that you've let him speak to you." The candid eyes of the tall lady examined him. They were grey eyes, wide and inquiring and amazingly innocent, and now there was a subtle light of laughter in them, as though she was infinitely but quietly amused about something. But he did not meet her eyes, for his were suddenly engrossed in a large portrait on a farther wall, a portrait startling and remarkable even in that dim light. It was a portrait in oils of a woman in a green dress sitting in a high-backed chair, and her head was pressed back against the back of the chair so that her throat was a clean and white line, and appalling in its suggestion of luxuriance, and the eyes of the woman in the green dress, as her head leant back against her chair, had in them the frightening candor of innocence, and they laughed at you, without mockery, as though she was infinitely but quietly amused about something, and her hair was golden, and yet only a fool would have called it golden, for it was of the color of fallen leaves on an October afternoon, russet brown and very dull gold shot with a fantasy of carmine. Anyway, the color of her hair was more like that of an October leaf than anything else. And as for her dress, who shall describe that green dress? For it was a strange and surprising dress, yet it was not a cheeky dress but witty, and it required from its wearer more than the virtue of dignity, though even that is a considerable virtue in young women nowadays. At its foot was just visible the sweet tip of a cherry shoe, but at its other end, the queenly end, at that end where a dress must die so that a woman's flesh may live for men's admiration and distress, at that end where a dress curves in glorious luxury over breasts and dies in a last effort to reach and clutch a slender throat. What of that queenly end of that green dress? It was contrived, without detracting an iota from the elegant formality of its wearer, so that it swept in a thin green strand from the bosom over one shoulder, and never returned over the other. For that other shoulder was startling white and naked. It was the kind of shoulder that men dream about in lonely moments. It was a shoulder wantonly divorced from the green dress which curved, ever so luxuriously, over but half one of the breasts of the subtly laughing woman with the eyes of innocent candor. And Ivor stared at her. "Ah, yes," he said, towards the portrait, "I know you now. I know you well." "Oh, but am I so famous then?" the lady cried pathetically, and Ivor turned to her thoughtfully. "That portrait is famous," he said. "It set everyone talking, even in wartime, and it set me longing. Years ago, the portrait of Pamela Starr by Augustus John, who, in the autumn of 1916, when it was on exhibition at the Grosvenor Galleries, did not hear of it. Never did portrait create such a stir or leave such an impression as the portrait of Pamela Starr. The Daily Mail at once called her a mystery woman, and the Evening News discovered a theory that the lovely creature was a Belgian refugee whom Major John had rescued at the risk of his life, and tried to interview the artist, but failed deplorably. And though there were not wanting fellow artists to say that the portrait was a literary masterpiece rather than a painting, which is a boring remark and means nothing, and though Mr. George Moore was heard to say, as he walked away from a long contemplation of the portrait, that painting had died with Manet, yet it was commonly admitted that whereas Gainsborough had painted a lady like a landscape, Augustus John had made a lady into a legend, and what lady, it was asked, would not rather be a legend than a landscape? I was on leave in 1916, Ivora told her, and I happened to walk into the Grosvenor Galleries. And there you were. You were a great help to me, Pamela Starr. You were indeed, and were you as curious about me then as you are courteous now? She asked him with a smile. They were standing close together. The room was an island and they were solitary and close on it. She smiled at him curiously, and Ivor had a funny feeling that he had never yet met a woman with such a clean, unveiled smile, absolutely frank. And he wondered about her age, thinking it must be that mysterious and intangible age which lies somewhere between 25 and 30. Everyone was curious about you, he told her. People wondered about you. They knew a little about you, you see, and on that little they built all kinds of gossip. And didn't Mr. John ever explain how quiet and harmless his sitter was? Asked Pamela Starr. John never speaks about his sitters. If you should ask him a question about them he wouldn't hear you. John is an artist, not a table decoration. And what kind of things did people wonder about me? Asked Pamela Starr. I want to know, please. For, you see, I know as little about people as they know about me. Less even, they wondered, said Ivor, if you really want to know, whether you were a courtesan or a virgin. And that's a great compliment to you, Pamela Starr, for there's generally no doubt about it one way or the other, and you. Oh, I wondered too. And now, are you still wondering? More than ever, he assured her. I'm not wondering, he explained quickly, whether you are a courtesan, for I think I know just enough about them to know that you're not one. And you look too wise to be a virgin. I'm just wondering about you, that's all. Shall I trust you? She put to him, ever so suddenly. Please, he said. Well, she began childishly, and hesitated. Her eyes, those candid eyes, were very full on him, they searched his. She gulped, smiled, and spoke swiftly. I'm a plumber's daughter, and yet I own this house and all that's in it and very much besides. In fact, I'm very, very rich. So, of course, she said softly, I'm not a virgin. Of course, and suddenly, from the recesses of that curious moment, there crept out laughter, and they laughed, those two, right at each other, a little shyly, a little wonderingly, like children uneasy under the burden of a new friendship. And then she said, very seriously, I wouldn't have let you speak to me in Down Street, if I hadn't seen that you hadn't the usual number of arms. You could do less damage with only one arm, I thought. Oh, I can do quite a lot. One's mind has 1,000 arms to hurt with, after all. I see, said Pamela Starr curiously. And then that one arm made as though to sweep away some debris. But how did we get talking of myself? I was just trying to find out about men, she confessed sweetly. I've known so very few. Ah, yes, you were telling me how you came to let me speak to you in Down Street, he remembered. Well, you know, I certainly wouldn't have dreamed of speaking to you if I had known who you were. I would have been frightened, and now, aren't you frightened? Oh, no. I like you, Pamela Starr. And again they laughed together, but, suddenly, she became very earnest, and he wondered at himself for not having observed before that the candid eyes were sad and that her mouth was just a little sad, as of a woman who might cry but will not. And now I'll confess to you, since you say you like me, she told him without jest, that I asked you here under false pretenses. But you've made no pretenses at all, he broke in quickly. That's what is so nice about you. I told you, she insisted, that I asked you to come in because I wanted you to talk to me a little. I lied, my friend. I asked you to come in because I wanted to make sure if I liked you or not. And if I did like you, I intended to show you something. I've simply got to show it to someone, don't you see? Something important. In fact, she said very slowly, I'm going to show you the most important, how does one say it, in my